The mic was muted. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. It is Tuesday, March 22nd of 2022. My screen started flashing at me, my streaming software, like this big alert, your mic is muted. I'm glad it did. Otherwise, who knows how long I would have gone there with the muted mic. But anyway, we've got some interesting questions here to talk about today. We'll get things started with a couple questions about NBA correlations. I see some questions about projections on the NHL side of things. A couple late swap questions here as well, some grouping questions, and a question about adding value to an NBA process. So let's go ahead and just get right into this. You'll see this is not the SaberSim app, and that is intended here. Going to get things started with a question that came in from Reed and JSJR. So this chart here, we'll zoom in a little bit so you guys can see this, was posted in the Slack channel the other night. And it is, I don't know where this is from, actually, but JSJR posted this. It is the NBA correlations data, apparently top 50 and bottom 50 here for players that have played minimum of 20 games together and average 24 minutes played. It says for key players. So I assume that is this player here. So assuming that this player averages 24 points a game. And Reed asks, can you speak to why these numbers may differ from SaberSim correlation numbers? I assume there's a sample size difference, but also these are all pretty strong positives when we hardly see any positives at all with teammates. And yeah, I think there are some pretty big issues with this data set, actually. And I wanted to talk about it because I think it's interesting. A good opportunity to talk about, you know, what to be careful of when you're looking into these kinds of things. And Reed points out here and makes a pretty strong case that there is a sample size issue here. You know, these when we are generating our correlations, we're talking about an average correlation for a player across thousands of different simulations of a given game. These are much, much smaller sample sizes. And I think it is an interesting point to be made that you can talk about a 43-game sample size in the case of DeLon Wright and DeAndre Hunter. And it is important to remember that is actually, in the grand scheme of things, a very small sample, especially to assess something like correlation, despite the fact that that's a little over half of an NBA season, right? What are long samples when you're looking at these data sets, or what feel like they can be big sample sizes in terms of real time can actually be very small sample sizes still in terms of the total amount of data points. It's very easy to, you know, imagine a situation where DeLon Wright and DeAndre Hunter, out of a 43-game sample size, generally play games that happen to play at a higher pace or go over the implied total, giving the implication that these correlations, that they are correlated 0.44, they have a coefficient of correlation of 0.44 or something like that, just because the games have tended to play at a higher pace. On that note, another situation is that because this is a correlation on average across different games, a lot of the noise, I think, that gets introduced here comes from the fact that this doesn't really say anything about the context of the individual game that it's in, right? You know, a situation where Dosunmu and Javonte Green are both likely to play together and get a lot of minutes and both have success, right? Are probably going to be games where, you know, maybe there are other injuries on the Bulls or situations like that, right? You are going to kind of have this sampling bias where because you're taking out the real single simulation of, or not simulation, real life is not, at least I think it's not a simulation, the real games that were actually played, but you're taking the single results of the actual game that was played rather than looking at a coefficient of correlation for a wide sample of what that game is going to be tonight. You introduce a lot of noise there. But I think the most compelling reason, or the biggest reason you can kind of tell that something is a little funny here, is actually a little bit more intuitive than that. And it really comes into when you start comparing these two lists. So there's a top 50 and a bottom 50. And I was looking through this morning because I did think this was kind of interesting. And you start to have some interesting questions arise here. First of all, I would say in the magnitude. These coefficients of correlation, 0.5, 0.46, 0.45, these correlations rival the correlations between a quarterback and his number one wide receiver on a team that relies heavily on the number one wide receiver, right? Let's just pull up some NFL correlations real quickly here. Green Bay would be perfect. Rodgers and Davante Adams, or what used to be Rodgers and Davante Adams, is one of the biggest QB to wide receiver correlations that we typically measure here, just because of how much Rodgers leans on Adams, or used to, in the passing attack. We'll see if we can get this to pull up. Yeah. So, it seems like by chance I picked a slate where Adams didn't play, but you can still see, right? A QB to wide receiver or tight end or something like that, coefficient of correlation of about 0.41%, right? These correlations are implying that there are basketball players in a sport where there is no way to score as many correlated points between two players in the same way there is like a passing touchdown, right? That they actually have positive correlations greater than those values. Right, that was the immediate red flag to me. Right, how can somebody? What can Dosunmu and Javonte Green do on the court together? What event can happen where they score so many points together that they have a stronger correlation than even a wide receiver or a wide receiver and a quarterback? But I think where it gets even kind of more obvious that something's going on here is that there's a almost a total random trend in terms of the magnitude, right? Why would Cole Anthony and Jalen Suggs have a negative correlation as strong as basically in this case, as strong as a QB against the opposing team defense, while DeLon Wright and DeAndre Hunter on a different team have a correlation as strong as the quarterback and the wide receiver, right? I think all of this is to say is that basically the methodology that's been taken here of taking a relatively small sample size that has across a whole bunch of different games that come at with a whole bunch of different context, and then coming up with the correlation between those two players in this set of data. I think this is basically totally random. I think this is at best descriptive of a set of past data. I would say there's probably very, very little predictive value from these correlations. I'd say this gives you no real indication that Dosunmu and Javonte Green are likely to continue playing in a way where their results are correlated with a coefficient of correlation that is as strong as 0.5. Basically, one of the strongest correlations we would measure in our simulations, period. And I think the intuitive eye to this is really the most compelling argument against it. And this is kind of like the way I would think through these things. When you're looking at this, or when you're looking into other tools or other content or articles or research that's done out there, right? Ask yourself, right? Does this make sense? What would this mean if this was true, right? What would this say about the sport of basketball if these correlations were actually true and they were predictive and reliable? Or even here's even a great example, right? Why would Javonte Green have the strongest measured positive correlation on this chart with Dosunmu of 0.5% while having the top 5 most negative correlation to his teammate Derrick Jones Jr., right? A negative correlation as strong as a QB and opposing team defense to one of his teammates, and a correlation as stronger than a QB to his number one wide receiver to one of his positive teammates. So I think it's interesting. I think it's a good opportunity to kind of talk about this and talk through, why maybe, I don't know, maybe not even why, how to look at some of this with a critical eye, kind of how to think about some of this, especially with the other tools at your disposal, with the other correlations at your disposal in the SaberSim app. But I personally would stay far, far away from this. I don't think this is very useful. And in fact, I think it could be downright misleading. I actually, John, if you're here, let me know where you found this. I really do appreciate you sharing this because I think it's always very useful to come on and talk about these things. But I'd be interested to hear. I'm very interested to see who published this, to be completely honest, because I don't put a lot of stock in this, and I'm curious Curious what this is. So if you're around, give me a shout. Let me know where you found this. If anybody else knows by chance where these are from, I think they're just screenshots as they are. Let me know. So, and that is not to say that our simulated correlation values are perfect by any means. I actually think, our NBA correlations have come a long, long way. That's why our correlation slider, the default value, has come up recently. Probably not for tonight's slate, for a 4-game slate, but the default value for correlation has recently been raised for NBA, because in our back testing, we're quite a bit more confident in our correlations than we have been in the past. I think when you go in here, you kind of intuitively you see the correlations that you intuitively expect most of the time now, right? Stars are generally somewhat negatively correlated to the other stars on their team, and players are negatively correlated to either players they 1-to-1 sub for in the rotation, or for players that occupy a very similar role. Right? Like Giannis and Bobby Portis both start, but they do a very similar thing on the court. There's a soft negative correlation there. Typically, if there are any positive correlations, they are very, 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 very slight positive correlations to the opposing team in the event that a game kind of shoots out or goes well over or something like that. Right? You'll see a similar situation here, right? Trae Young negatively correlated with some of the guys, his other stars, his other best players on his team, but mostly some of the other players that do a similar thing. Right? There's a little bit of an opportunity cost to doing things on the basketball court, right? There are only so many points that can be scored. There are only so many assists that can be had, so many rebounds over the course of the game. So as one player kind of collects up those stats, it does leave less for other players out there. That's kind of the idea of why these negative correlations generally exist. The other reason too is, of course, that there can only be 5 players on the court. So players that do the same thing and do sub out directly for each other, that has an impact as well. But right, DeRozan probably a very classic example of a negative correlation with Levine too. Very, very similar kind of player. So anyway, good stuff. Thank you again for sharing, and thank you again, Reed, for asking the question too, because I think it was a good opportunity to talk about today. So, but for now, let's keep it going. All right, let's keep it going. This question is from Six Fever. And I see some questions in YouTube chat. We will get to everything, I promise. I'm going to start with the Slack questions. Six Fever says, question about the late swap. It's an amazing tool, saves me a lot of time. But my question is, how often should you late swap during a slate every time news breaks? Yes. The best practice, like the true best advice I can give, is if you see a simulation run in the NBA lineup alerts channel or any of the lineup alerts channel, or this has changed, this last updated tag has changed since you updated your lineups, it is probably best practice to late swap. That means that something has changed on our end, right? Minutes have adjusted. It can be something as big as a slight minutes adjustment from one of our data providers where we think one player is going to get an additional minute that we didn't expect. Or it can be something huge like, Jokic isn't going to play, right? Slate breaking news that you absolutely need to adjust for. So the best practice recommendations that I can recommend overall are to late swap anytime Sims run. Now, if you are comfortable with it, I think you can add a little bit of your own judgment there, right? Especially on games, on slates with a ton of games, right? There is a big difference in value added from a single minute projection changing to a star player getting ruled out. And there are, a variety of different ways you can go about figuring out for yourself what has changed here. What I like to do is I will use the Basketball Monster player news dashboard, and I will late swap if I see a sim has run and I see that there is something as a line item here, right? Some news. Sometimes it's a player getting ruled out. Sometimes it's a player like this, right? Alex Caruso is supposed to start, right? As long as there is a piece of news that is here, I will typically late swap. I won't necessarily, if a sim runs and I don't see that there is any news that has come out, there's nothing on the Underdog Twitter, there's nothing on the Basketball Monster dashboard, anything like that. Sometimes I won't swap, but that is something that I'm kind of comfortable with. I follow the NBA quite a bit. I feel pretty comfortable being able to identify, that's a big deal. That isn't. If you aren't as comfortable doing that, just swap every time a sim runs. And if you're not even comfortable following how often a sim runs or how often this timestamp is changing, you are never going to hurt yourself by over late swapping. even if your actual lineup that you had beforehand may have outperformed the late swapped lineup, that's just bad luck. That's just bad variance. That can happen the opposite direction just as easily, where your lineup you swapped to got scored better than your original lineup, even though no news changed, right? That's purely luck. At worst, late swapping when you don't need to is going to be neutral EV, right? So let's say you're playing tonight and the first 2 games have started and you're going into the night slate games, the Bulls, Bucks, and Clippers, Nuggets, and you see some sims run and you can't find any news and you're not sure if you should swap, and you just do, right? And in reality, none of the projections changed. At worst, that is neutral EV. That is no impact on the quality of your lineups. It's just a reshuffling. At best, you may have missed some subtle thing. Maybe we expected, the Bucks do this fairly often. Maybe we expected Holiday, Giannis, Portis, Allen, and Connaughton as your starting lineup. I'm just assuming that's what it is. But in reality, it was a night where maybe George Hill got the start, right? For some strange reason. Who knows, right? Maybe Connaughton wasn't starting. And on a 4-game slate, George Hill went from being a 4.15x and not even in your player pool to a 5.67x decent little value play, right? That wasn't really newsworthy. Most of the field probably didn't even adjust to. And there's a good opportunity to have swapped, right? So again, best practice, sim runs, projections change, any news breaks at all, you should swap. You can be a little more selective about that, I think, if you feel comfortable making that decision for yourself. But if you are not sure, just do the swaps because it's never going to hurt you. So, okay. All right. Question from Kick to the Head here. And he said, hi, Jordan. Question on how player projections are created in NHL. Are the projections created strictly based on the simulation data, or are real-life statistics taken into account? For example, if Crosby has been on a hot streak, his last 5 games, and he's around 18 to 20 points per real-life game, is that taken into account, or are the numbers based only on how he performs in the Sims? Thank you. I guess this applies to other sports as well. It does. It's an interesting question. So let's jump over to hockey, just since you mentioned hockey. And I see there's been a little bit of back and forth in Slack about this as well. Haven't had the chance to read that. But yeah, I mean, let's use your exact example, right? So our projection for Sidney Crosby on tonight's slate is 14.78 fantasy points. All that number is one thing and one thing alone. It is the average, the mathematical mean of Crosby's fantasy point output across all of our simulations. The actual exact formula for what that number is it is the total number of fantasy points that Crosby scores in every game sim we have for his game divided by the total number of simulations. That is all that number is, and that is all that number is used for in the app. It is a way of explaining this information boiled down to one more number to try to be as helpful to you as possible. The builder does not care what that number is. The only situation where the builder cares what that number is if your sim variance is at 0. At sim variance 0, in every single lineup, you are going to use the average projection. You're going to use the entire data set of simulations. But at every other sim variance setting, we are going to randomly bucket the simulations for Crosby's game, and for a given lineup, build the best possible lineup for that individual set of simulations. So that 14.78 average projection virtually never gets used unless by pure luck you pull a set of simulations where his projection in that set of sims is exactly his average, which is a pretty unlikely outcome overall. So the projections are strictly based on the simulation data, but they are not really used in a way that maybe you might be accustomed to with a traditional tool. Now, the second question I think is a little more interesting. Are real life statistics taken into account? Hot streaks, I guess, in particular. They are and they are not. So we have an understanding of what we believe a player to be, what quality of player we believe a player to be. And that's done with historical data. And we have what is basically called a decay rate in our tools that determines how much we treat information that happened 2 years ago compared to how much we treat information that happened last week. obviously, for some players, and this varies for different sports, but we don't want to discount somebody that has played hockey for as long as Sidney Crosby, right? We want to take into account his career data, what we understand him to be as a hockey player. But it's also important to treat a little more importantly the things that have happened more recently, right? So in that way, we will pick up on if a player is playing better or worse and what that may or may not mean, especially if it's showing up in their rates. So I'm going to switch from hockey over to basketball real quickly because I don't know the sport of hockey as well. But for example, if we're talking about basketball, right? Let's say that Steph Curry was on a hot streak, right? It would mean a different thing to us if Steph Curry was on a hot streak because he was shooting 70% from three versus if he was on a hot streak because he was suddenly taking 30% more threes a game, right? One of those things is going to be a little bit more predictive, right? The idea that somebody or that his usage has jumped to 45%, maybe because of a key injury to somebody else on the team, right? That is much more predictive. That's something that's a little more reliable. That's a little more explainable. A player like Curry, who probably has shot maybe a career 38% from three, 40. I don't know exactly what that number is. Suddenly shooting 60% from three for a 4-game sample size is not as predictable. So if we do treat short-term results as valuable. They are incorporated into the data, especially when they have a predictable or predictive reason for a player suddenly having a change in performance. But we are not doing something like measuring a hot streak or a player scoring far more than their average over a small data set and then intentionally increasing a projection from there. So, I don't know. I think I explained that pretty well. I'm looking for maybe if there's kind of an example that might indicate this well, but I think kind of made the point here. So let me know if that helps and if there's still any follow-up questions there. But yeah, good question. All right. K-Mac asked a question about conditional groups. He said, is there a way to create a group where if 3 Knicks are in one lineup to force at least one player in from the Hawks? The short answer is at the moment, no. Unfortunately, there is not. There is a way that you can select for lineups that follow these rules, but there is not a way with the way that groups are currently implemented to create a conditional group like this, where you say, if this thing about the lineup, then take this action. Our grouping rules, you can say, you can group certain players together and you could potentially group all the players from the Knicks and Hawks together and say something like, max 4. And you can kind of get close, but you can't do the exact conditional thing that you're talking about here. One thing you can do is you can filter out lineups that don't follow your rules in step 3 if you would like to. So I'll show you what that would look like. So we can build some lineups here. And this actually works pretty good. The two problems are that it removes big chunks from your lineup pool. So if you have a lot of these you want to do, you can be left with suddenly not very many lineups left. And second, it's not very easy to get late swap to follow along very nicely here because it's not a rule. We're just removing lineups from our pool. But how this would look if you wanted to is you would go to your teams and then your stacks, right? And actually, for the sake of making this easy, I'm going to say basically show me all lineups that have a actually, yeah, this would be a little tricky. So what we'll have to do is I'm going to say, show me all lineups that have a New York stack. And then just for the sake of the example, I'm going to go through and remove any of them that don't have Trae Young. So we're going to filter by has a Knicks stack, doesn't have Trae Young, and then I'm going to go into my pool and I'm going to trash all of these at once. So you can see in this particular case, 4-game slate where this is the best game environment on the slate, it's going to remove a lot of lineups from our pool. But from here, we could go back and fill up to 20. And now in this particular example here, it's not going to be perfect by any means, but any lineup that has 2+ Knicks will now also always have Trae Young. So I think that can kind of help get you there, especially if there's like maybe just a couple small situations that you want to target. If you're going to do this, I would recommend building a much bigger pool size, like 1,500 lineups, so you have enough lineups to work with. And then keep in mind that you can run into a little bit of trouble with late swap. I think long-term, it is our plan to add conditional groups here. Yeah, it's not a very easy way to do it at the moment. The one other thing I'll say about this is that I think one other way that you could kind of do this is to turn your correlation slider up. So if we look at the correlations here, right? Most of the Knicks are not going to have very strong correlations with the Hawks players, but they're at least going to have mostly neutral, right? Maybe some like very, very slightly negative correlations, but they are generally going to have negative correlations with each other for reasons we just talked about. If you really wanted to, if you basically what this group is trying to do is you're basically trying to tell the builder, hey, I think correlation is important tonight, right? Our sliders say it's not. Our sliders say what is important tonight is basically building a well-leveraged against ownership lineup that has a high variance, right? That is optimal for a very small set of simulations and to go that route. Now, if you came back and said, no, I think correlation is important, right? Maybe you put it at 6, right? I think that would be a good way to, you are not going to be able to get this guaranteed rule where never 3 Knicks without 1 Hawk, but you are telling the builder, hey, think about correlation. I want you to prioritize correlation in my lineup building process. And you can at least experiment with this and kind of see what we're getting out of it. And I'm actually interested to see what we get here. The problem is that there's only 4 games on the slate, right? Correlations there are negative correlations between every player on the same team, right? And the Knicks are in a really good spot tonight where they're just projected very well. But I think this will help that along, right? So here's 3 Knicks, no Hawks, right? Oh yeah, no, Trae's in that lineup. So yeah, actually it seems like this has kind of helped. So I would experiment with going that route. And if you're finding that it's not helping enough, maybe even try bringing up that correlation a little higher. So, but it looks like this has actually helped quite a bit. So. And the reason why this kind of helps is because, these are not super strong negative correlations, right? These are not objectively big values, but you kind of get the same stacking effect you get in baseball, but in reverse here, right? Where, yeah, you may use RJ Barrett may get thrown into a lineup with Mitchell Robinson, and there's a negative 0.8 correlation there that isn't a big enough value for the builder to take out. But if you add in Emmanuel Quickly, then RJ Barrett's negatively correlated to both Robinson and Quickly, but also Robinson's negatively correlated to Quickly. And the more and more players you add, there's a stacking component of negative correlation that as you turn the correlation slider up, the builder really, really won't like. So if you are trying to avoid that, that would be, I actually think as I've talked through this, I would say probably the best practice way to get the impact you are looking for on the slate tonight would be to turn the correlation slider up, as opposed to stripping lineups out with the filters or anything like that. Because that will also be a little bit more effective for when it comes time to late swap as well. So, all right. Mark asks a question that I am a little bit sad to answer here. He said, please talk through or show how the PGA Match Play sims will work to correlate optimal lineups. We don't have support for Match Play for golf, unfortunately. It is a totally different game type where the way that the event plays out is completely different. So our sims don't really transfer over at all. The strategy is quite a bit different as well. It is an event where essentially lineup construction ends up being crucial. Your goal in this event is to maximize the number of golfers that you can have in a 6 golfer lineup that are playing at the end, right? Obviously only one guy can win, right? So you can't pick all 6 guys that can win, but you certainly don't, you almost never actually, you probably just never want 2 players that are starting in the same group. And if you look at the bracket, you can kind of make sure that you also don't have, you have 6 golfers, right? So you want to make sure all 6 can end up in the final 8, for example. It's basically like a bracket for those of you that kind of aren't familiar with this. So the unfortunate reality is that we don't have sims for it. We're not going to have projections. We won't have sims projections or ownership for the match play event. But if you have access to an alternative set of projections, actually, I'm not going to say that. If you have access to an alternative set of projections, if you upload custom projections, the builder will work. It will build. It will not have distributions. It will basically be working like a traditional optimizer. But using our new group setting, you can group out players that are in the same group and in the same segments of the bracket and make sure that you're not getting too many of those players. And I think there can be a big edge for this event. So it has been a difficult thing to prioritize getting a working sim up on our end for this because it's hard and there's only 1 or 2 events that are match play the entire year. So it's difficult to justify until it's the week of the event. And it's like, man, we really need a sim for this. But unfortunately, we won't have real support here for it. But I think there's an edge here if you can build the groups out. So, yeah, good question. And I'm sorry that that's the answer. But it is definitely a fun event if you're playing. All right, cool. Reed says, hey, Jordan, do you know if a Fire tablet can handle the late swapping doodles that an iPad does? I assume so, but I don't know for sure. But I assume it's an Android device, so it probably can. If it's a different operating system, I don't really know what a Fire tablet runs. If it's a different, unique operating system, it's possible there could be some issues. You'd probably give it a good walkthrough, a good test before you're actually like live right before lock trying to do it, so that you know that you're not doing it all for the first time right before lock. But I can't see any reason why it wouldn't work. So, okay, cool. We are caught up to the messages in Slack that came in before the start of the stream. I'm going to hop over and get the other messages that have been waiting in YouTube chat, and then we'll circle back. Nancy Drew Guy said, what is 1 or 2 statistics that SaberSim does not take into account in terms of the NBA? Is that for a team statistic or an individual statistic? So this question comes in occasionally here. Not a very easy question to answer. There are not really any, I wouldn't say there are any stats or quantitative metrics out there that we believe are predictive and useful that we are not taking into account. Because if we did think that, then we would just take it into account. What I would instead focus your energy on is looking at situations where something is inherently difficult to project for one reason or another. And there's not always going to be a slate every night or a game every night that has this situation. Some slates are going to be very easy to project. The less games on a slate overall, the easier the less likely it is that there's one game that's kind of a difficult or interesting situation. But situations where there's a key player injured or a key set of players injured, especially in a situation where that player was injured recently, right? Like maybe this is their team's first game playing without that player. And especially if there's not a lot of data, if that player hasn't been hurt throughout the year very much, if we don't know what that player, if that team's going to do when that player is injured, right? I'm looking on the slate tonight to see if there's actually a good example, but a lot of these guys have definitely spent some time off the court. Jokic used to be the go-to example, but he has had at least some injury issues over the last couple of years. For a while, he was like a kind of a warrior, almost never injured. But that was actually a perfect example, right? When Jokic had his wrist problems earlier this season, I think that was last year, right? I think there was a statistic that he had never missed a game since he had been first announced as a starter. Knowing exactly how the Nuggets are going to navigate that is an inherently a hard situation to project. The trade deadline is a perfect example, right? Big shuffles around for the Nets and Sixers with the Harden trade, right? What do minutes look like, especially for more of the role players after that kind of thing happens? Well, every model is going to make its best guess at how to assess that, including ours, but that is an inherently murky situation to address, right? There's a limit to how precise any model can accurately describe what the new Nets rotation and what the new Nets usage and fantasy points per minute for the different players is going to be after they trade away Harden, who soaks up a ton of that, right? And it's a totally different situation for the Sixers on the other side, who are gaining that player, right? So I would, instead of trying to go in and say, what's the one thing that SaberSim's not taking into account, take a critical eye to each game on the slate. Be skeptical. Look at what are the best overall value plays. Look at what the high ownership plays are. Here's a good one, right? Obi Toppin, right? Projected as a 9x value on tonight's slate. As somebody that has not researched this slate for a minute tonight, maybe that's you too, ask yourself why, right? Why is that? What's the situation here? Julius Randle's out, right? Well, okay. Obi Toppin's projected for 30 minutes. We don't have a starting lineup yet, right? But I think it is an interesting question. As far as I'm aware, Julius Randle has not spent much time off the court this year, right? This is kind of a unique situation for tonight's slate. It certainly might be Obi Toppin that gets some additional run. What if it's Jericho Sims? What if it's split? What if one player starts and the other still ends up getting more minutes, right? How does usage break down when different combinations of these players are on the court? All of this is stuff that we are attempting to answer with our simulations. So by no means should you feel like you have to do this level of research. This is kind of what we are trying to automate and make easy for you. But assuming you want to spend more time doing research to add value to your NBA process, this is how I would focus it. And on a 4-game slate like tonight, unless there is something else going on here that I'm not looking at, it seems like the main murky situation, at least the way I would describe it, is probably on the Knicks, right? Where there's certainly going to be value there, but where that value comes from, exactly which players get the minutes, who gets the run, right? Who gets most of the usage. That's where I think it's a little bit murky. And I think that would be a more interesting opportunity to make adjustments, right? Than trying to research some other statistic that is arbitrarily not included in the model, right? And when I do this, I like to take an ownership angle at it too, right? I at 53.6, a 52.6% projected ownership for Toppin right now. Even if he starts, I would be looking for reasons on a 4-game slate in my research to potentially bring this projection down. Doesn't have to be a full fade. You might bring this projection down to 24 points, and he's projected 7.5x, and he's still the best overall projected player on a slate, and you go from 100% exposure to 75% exposure. And that might add value if you're right, if you're directionally right. But you can kind of I think you can use ownership as a reason to guide you, right? Like Jericho Sims at 8% projected ownership on a 4-game slate where Julius Randle is not playing. Same actually thing with Mitchell Robinson. To me, I would not need a lot. I would not need much to come up with a reason to bump their projections a little bit. And I think that is way higher value research than going and looking at like DVOA charts or historical usage or fantasy point per minute charts or things like that, because that kind of stuff is captured in a more robust way already in the model. But there's a limit to how precise we can project this game tonight, period, because of the fact that it is a strange situation that has not occurred often. There's a lot of kind of induction that has to happen to figure out how the Knicks are going to play with Julius Randle off the court. And it's entirely possible that I'm just like sounding like an idiot here and Randle didn't play the last game or has been hurt recently. As far as I'm aware, even if he had it, it's still, I think this is still a valid point. But as far as I'm aware, he has not spent much time off the court this year. And I mean, another thing that'll happen too is like if a guy gets hurt mid-game, a lot of times the guy that comes in and subs for him and gets that guy's minutes that game is not the guy that ends up standing to benefit the most as the rotation readjusts. So kind of making an assumption here, not entirely sure about this, but if this is a situation where Randle got hurt in game and Toppin came in and got his minutes and had a big night, it might be a good situation where, it might be worth double checking that. So. And it's also possible too, that they play like a different style of basketball, right? That they match up and maybe play a little smaller against the Hawks, right? Capella's not the tallest center. I think you can match up and play a little smaller against the Hawks for sure. So, all right. Peter said, how would I set max exposure by position? I think probably the easiest thing to do would be to just do this within the build, right? As opposed to setting this beforehand. You could, yeah, I think that's probably the easiest. So let's say, I think like especially a decent example of where you might want to do that is on FanDuel on a bigger slate in the center position where you basically have one shot. Center is a really high scoring position. There's often a lot of good ones on the slate. And on FanDuel, you really only get the one. I think it'd be an interesting idea to cap your player exposures at center. Not to say this is a must, but I think it's an interesting idea here, especially on a slate where there's a lot of good centers out there. So if you wanted to do this, I think the easiest thing to do would be to just do this in step 3, rather than setting a global cap in step 1. So, maybe you come over here, decent example tonight, right? Maybe you say maximum 40% of one center. And in this case, it was easy as that. But I think you're better off doing your by position max exposures in step 3. Brad said, at what point do you ever draw a line on using lines above a certain SaberScore? Never. I never do that. I think there was a conversation in Slack earlier today about that, and I don't really understand that. Brad said, I was messing around with showdown lines and had to expand my pool a few times and was getting SaberSim lines in the thousands, and the score was in the 70s. Would you say that's too far back? Oh, okay. Would you draw a line using lines below a certain SaberScores? It sounds like what this question is really at. I don't think about this from the standpoint of the actual value of the SaberScore. What I do is on almost all of my builds, I build 1,500 as a pool size, and I never expand it for me, ever. For me, if I'm expanding it, what the builder is saying is that based on what is optimal for this contest, with the simulations as they are currently set, I have exceeded the best 1,500 lineups that are possible for that slate. And to me, that is a red flag that I need to go back and take something out, because I'm doing so much that I'm probably, from my perspective, I'm probably becoming suboptimal. And that's not because at that point, the SaberScore goes under 85 or goes under 75 or goes under 70. It is just because of the absolute number of lineups. I don't, as somebody that is at max probably playing 150 unique lineups in any given slate, there's not really any reason where I feel like I need to exceed the best 1,500 to get those. And if I do, I'm probably doing too much in my exposures. So I think about it that way, less so about the absolute value of the SaberScore itself. So I do think, so to kind of pull back, because I just misread this here at the start, I do think that is a good idea, right? Limiting or using at least as a red flag or an opportunity to check yourself as like, am I having to build a lot more lineups is great. But I would not cap under a certain SaberScore, just say under a certain SaberScore, I'm not going to use those lineups. Any lineup within your initial pool of 1,500, I think is viable. So Eric says, NBA has been rough for me. I hope it turns around. Not sure what I'm doing wrong lately. I think I was late swapping too much. I probably think it's not late swapping too much. I think late swapping, again, is my belief that late swapping at worst is going to be neutral. This is a tough time of year with unpredictability. I think it gets harder to project NBA, period. You get into a situation where teams will kind of visibly give up on games. Minutes get harder to project when teams have a little less incentive to compete for every single game. Teams are looking ahead to the playoffs. There's also a lot of casual competition that have fallen off from NBA at this point. You're playing against a sharper pool of DFS players that are still interested in grinding NBA nightly or even weekly in late March. So I think your highest ROI overall is going to be at the start of most seasons. Eric said, pretty much just waiting for MLB. I think that's also fine. Nothing wrong with just pausing until you get to baseball season too, right? Especially, if you're on tilt a little bit anyway and not enjoying it, wait till MLB. I got no problem with that. Or better yet, go try something new. We got NASCAR sims, MMA sims, Formula One sims, some nice weekly sports with a huge edge in taking advantage of simulations there, right? take a couple days off, take the rest of the week off from NBA, get ready for a weekend of racing and fighting sports. It'll definitely feel like a switch up for you. So Eric said play golf. Yeah, I love golf DFS. I do. But I don't know if my first recommendation for somebody that was kind of tilting towards the end of NBA season would be to go play golf DFS. Because that is I think that's worse. Like that's a harder sport to stomach. I think golf DFS, you have to be just like the slightest bit masochistic to really enjoy it, because it's pretty random. And it's tough. But said I won a qualifier in golf last week. Congrats. That's great. That's awesome. We do have Masters week coming up, so that'll be exciting. But okay, anyway, let's refocus here. Steven said, can you help me make a player pool? I cannot get one lineup to even come close to first. The sliders, do I have to mess with them? Okay, a couple things to unpack here. So I don't think the right approach on SaberSim really, personally, is to do either of these things. You don't need to set a player pool on SaberSim in the same way that you may have to on other optimizers, because we're using simulations to build your lineups, right? You're not going to get a player that's not a good play just thrown into a lineup by pure luck, because every lineup is represented by a set of simulations. I also don't think it's a great idea to go adjusting sliders, right? The sliders have been back tested to what we believe the optimal values are by running thousands of lineups at each individual setting and comparing them to past contests. Honestly, Steven, I think the best advice I could give you here is to make sure that you are playing the best contests possible and using sound bankroll management advice, right? I think the best place I would point you in the direction here is, if you haven't seen it, to watch our video on NBA contest selection and make sure you are taking advantage of playing the best contests. You can be making good lineups and entering them into bad contests and ending up with bad results as a result of that. Right. So this video, the fastest way to crush DFS in 2021, it's from the beginning of the season, but I walk through the DraftKings lobby and the FanDuel lobby and point out the exact contests that I recommend playing that I think are the softest contests in the lobby. I get a lot of questions from people. I've been getting a lot of questions from people lately that are like, how do I beat 100-mans on FanDuel? That is one of the hardest contests to beat, that are especially at the lower stakes, right? 100-man 3-maxes, if there are 10 people in that lobby that are sharp, they're going to take up so much equity in that contest, you are never going to turn a profit or beat the rake against them long term, right? So I think that is probably my best advice. And from there, if I can get you to watch one other video, I'd watch this one. What does the variance after 100 slates look like for a winning player? I think anytime I'm hearing anybody getting frustrated about the results, I recommend watching this video, because it shows for a player. I have literally hard coded in long-term profit into the example I've given here, right? There is no way mathematically that in this video, the example I've given in the spreadsheet I've set up, that player could be unprofitable long-term. But you can see, even in a 100 slate sample, a 100 slate sample is bigger than the entire NBA season. You can still have a down year. That just goes to show you what that means about 1 week or one slate, right? If you can be a long-term profitable player and still have a down year, you can absolutely have a losing week, a losing month, a losing 2 weeks, certainly a losing day. And I think it's important to remember that as well. And that kind of explains why bankroll management is so important, and why the contest selection is also important. But that would be my best advice to you, Stephen. I think Brad says that video was a real eye opener. I think it's honestly something that people don't talk enough about in the DFS space. There's an expectation, I think, especially in 100K Bink screenshot land on Twitter, that there are people winning every night. Or put another way, that if you do the perfect thing tonight, you will Bink, right? That there is a set amount, there's a set of steps you could take on tonight's slate and perfectly engineer the optimizer to give you the nuts. And if you do that and figure out exactly what the steps are, that you Bink. And the reality is that even in probably the lowest variance DFS sport there is in basketball, or one of the lowest variants, the actual variance of the game is still so high that you're playing for profitability over the course of a season, not a night, not a week, not a month, not 2 months, arguably not even a season. maybe even like just truly long-term. And you do that by managing your bankroll, playing the best contests, and sticking to a process that is repeatable, that works night after night, and trusting that works out. But believe me, Steven, if there was something that we knew that you could just do here, that I would say, oh, you're stuck, your slider should actually be this, then those would be the defaults. Or if there was a player pool thing that I could say, do this, change your player pool, only include players that are playing more than 20 minutes a night. That would be the default value. Our goal here has basically been to identify as many value adds as possible and automate them to take out as much busy work as possible, and give you the opportunity to add additional value to yourself from there. So Steven said I play the 5 cent on FanDuel. Yeah, so that contest is a good one, the 5 cent 150 max, but it is still one that is kind of, it's going to take a long time to realize the edge on that because you're playing against 250,000 other lineups. I would continue to play that. I think that $7.50 to max. I think if it were up to me and you were playing $7.50 a night, I might recommend that you instead play, not like there's going to be a massive difference between these two contests, like suddenly like turning on a light switch and all of a sudden you start taking it down every night. But I might recommend that the fadeaway, the 25 cent 20 max, may be a better bang for your buck. It's going to have more effective entrance than this contest. And it is also a lower total number of entries. So your absolute value of winning is going to be a little bit higher. And you are going to be rewarded a little bit more when you do take it down. I think with $7.50, you might find that it's a better investment to play, maybe a $10. The $5 here, play the dribbler, the swat, and the block, and build 25 unique lineups and play that instead. That might be a little bit. That's kind of min-maxing contest selection. I don't feel entirely confident that that's actually true. But I think it probably would be. You'd probably be slightly better off playing that. So, all right, cool. And then, okay, let me get to a couple of these other questions here from Slack, and then we'll begin to wrap up here for today's stream. If you have any other questions, if you're listening here, we're at about the 5-minute mark, 7-minute mark. Let me know. Pop your questions into the YouTube chat. Pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack, and we'll get to the last few questions. This is from CMC Man. He said, how can I efficiently implement a strategy where I don't play any studs, salary above 9K, in a percentage of my lineups? I was thinking of setting up a filter in step 1 to remove studs, then run a build for 10 lineups with the filter and 10 without the filter, then manually editing the CSV file to combine the two. Problem is this is time consuming and I don't know how to maintain it through late swap. Is there another way to do this? Somehow setting up groups. I don't know. I don't know of a good way to do this in only 50% of your lineups. I think what you are doing is likely what you would need to do here to get this done. I would probably honestly kick this back to you and ask why you want to do this. I'm just curious, genuinely. I think one of the advantages of using simulations, and I know, especially for those of you that are here every day watching this, you probably hear this a lot, but I think it's important to reinforce. One of the advantages of using simulations is that you are not getting lineup constructions by pure luck, ever. There's no lineup construction that purely because a player fits on their average projection and their salary and their position, that a random assortment of players get thrown up into a lineup together that lineup actually never is optimal. Every lineup you build with SaberSim, whether it is a stars and scrubs construction or a really balanced build construction, is represented by an individual set of outcomes of the way that the slate can play out. And actually taking it one step further, the exposure to certain outcomes you are getting in your lineups, right? Or the exposure, the percentage of lineups in your pool that have stars and scrubs constructions versus balance builds constructions is already optimized for how often those constructions are optimal in that set of sims on that slate. Basically, what I'm saying is if you're saying in general that you don't think more than 50% of the optimal lineups are stars and scrubs constructions, that is a rule of thumb. That is a generalization as an answer to a question that the sims, at least in theory, should answer far more efficiently. So I don't want to say that this is like a bad idea or just strike this down, but I'd be curious to hear like kind of how you got down this path, because I think to me that this sounds like a lot of busy work in a way that's not going to add a lot of value in actually making your lineups better. I mean, with that said, I think probably the easiest thing to do would be to use the filter, eliminate those lineups that are eliminate those players that are over 9K, build some lineups, and then build another set without that on top there. And I think it gets a little bit tricky there. I think like another option would be to do something like, instead of saying that this is something you're going to do in 50% of your lineups, maybe set a rule where you say max one of all the 10K players, right? So for tonight, you take Jokic, Giannis, and Trae Young, right? And say less than or equal to 1 here would be like an alternative of saying, at most, I'm only going to use one of these guys. But I think this is still a generalization to solve a problem that the simulations themselves are going to do much better. So, and then, Carl asked quickly here, hey, Jordan, how do I know if a sim has just run? And Maverick kindly responded quickly. The NBA-lineup-alerts channel in Slack will tell you specifically if when sims, it will tell you when news is breaking, when sims are starting, and when they are completing. A very quick way of seeing this quickly in the app is to just see the last updated timestamp, but this does not show you what games ran and what games ran when. The Slack alerts channels will do that. So, but all right. I don't see any other questions, so we'll go ahead and leave it there. Thank you to everybody that tuned in, participated, asked questions, just watched along, lurked. To everybody that watches and listens to this stream after it goes up on YouTube, appreciate you as well. For that group in particular, thank you for your patience with me, your quiet patience with me here this week. I know there's been a little bit of a delay in getting these videos up, the recordings up in a timely manner. I know yesterday's recording still needs to get posted and timestamped and posted up to the YouTube channel. So appreciate you guys for being patient with me. I'll get to those here this afternoon and make sure that yesterday's show and today's show are both up on YouTube here before the end of the day today. We will be right back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, and that will actually be our last office hours stream of the week. I'm going to be out of town for a couple days here. SaberSim team will be taking a 2-day pause on office hours, and we will be right back on Monday of next week for another stream. So if you guys have questions in the meantime, especially some questions that you desperately need answered here on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, feel free to pop them into the office hours channel in Slack. We'll have people kind of keeping an eye on that and happy to kind of write out some responses to those over the weekend here. Won't be any stream, though, on Thursday or Friday. So stream tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, back at it on Monday, and we'll go from there. So good luck tonight on the 4-game NBA slate. Good luck if you're playing the hockey slate. I know there's a big hockey slate. And for those of you that are playing the match play event for PGA Tour, I know still sad to say that we don't have support for that on the simulation side, but if you are playing the match play event, enjoy that as well. So thank you, everybody. We'll leave it there. Take care. Have a good rest of your day, and see you later.